The other development is that it's clear the fighting's becoming harder, and all the reports from the frontline towns suggest more people being killed than in previous days. The main reason why the two sides are so deadlocked is because neither is particularly strong. But all the same, it's hardly surprising the words civil war are beginning to appear more frequently to describe what's happening in Libya. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera.
Well, the fighting in Libya continues to fuel a major humanitarian crisis as migrant workers flee to neighbouring countries. Mohammed Val has been monitoring the situation in the Tunisian border town of Ras Ashdir.
This is the Ras Ashdir border crossing between Tunisia and Libya, and as you can see, it's relatively calm today, particularly in comparison to the last few days when we saw an influx of more than 10,000 people every day. Today, they are speaking here about a few hundred only. And as you can see, there are more aid workers and Tunisian security and military here than foreign workers trying to get out of Libya. We have been talking to various people trying to understand why, considering that we know that there are still hundreds of thousands of workers stranded in Libya.
There are a lot of West African, sub-Saharan African migrant workers in Libya are afraid to leave wherever they're hiding. I have spoken to Ghanaians, Nigerians, Malians, Chadians. They all say that they're afraid. They're afraid of violence, they're afraid of being beaten up by what they call local youth. We also have contractual workers coming from Asian countries. Their company are probably still keeping them on contract. And then you have a lot of migrant workers who've paid a lot of money to intermediaries to come here and work in Libya, and they're probably hedging their bets for the moment, depending on how the situation evolves. And of course, there's the overall military situation on the ground, which is obviously probably not propitious to people moving towards the border areas.
According to international relief agencies, more than 1 million foreign workers are still in Libya. Whether they have decided not to leave or came under pressure from the Libyan authorities is not clear. But what is clear is that just crossing the border is not the end of the troubles for many of those foreign workers. And as you can see, we have thousands of Bangladeshis here who have been stranded for more than a week, unable to find any means of transport back home.
Well, as we've been hearing, much of the oil industry is now in the hands of Libya's opposition. But revenues from the sale of oil to Europe are still going to Tripoli. While America's sanctions prohibit money being paid to the Libyan central bank, those imposed by other countries do not. And critics say that oil money is continuing to prop up Gaddafi's government. Al Jazeera's Rory Challens has more.
Oil. Libya has it. The rest of the world needs it. Under the hot, dry desert sands lies the source of 95% of the country's export earnings. As the Libyan government cracks down on protesters, the international community is trying to push Colonel Gaddafi's financial pressure points. But this British newspaper says the oil trade is still pumping millions of dollars into the country and potentially into the hands of Gaddafi's regime.
Is the money from the central bank being used for the good of Libya, for the citizens and for his economy, or is being used as the pocket money from the Gaddafi family to do whatever they are doing right now in Libya? That's a big question mark that no one can answer. But at the moment, the sanctions in Europe are only targeting individuals, so like the family of Muammar Gaddafi, and they are not targeting institutions such as the central bank.
The web of international sanctions brought down on the Libyan government has plenty of gaps in it. Al Jazeera understands businesses from China, India and Austria are still buying Libyan oil completely legally. That's not to say the violence isn't hurting the government's pockets, though.
A lot of the foreign oil companies have pulled their staff out. These staff are essential for the operations that are taking place there. So while production is continuing just now at much reduced levels, in the long term, this is not sustainable.
Libya's oil fields, like the ones in the Sirte Basin, El Bouri and El Hamra, provide Colonel Gaddafi's regime with 80% of its revenue. In 2010, exports were about 1.3 million barrels a day. Last week, that had slumped to under 600,000 barrels a day, and it's still falling. But despite Libya's financial vulnerability, there's been little international talk of an oil embargo. There's scant desire for action which might push oil prices higher, regardless of how many Libyan lives that oil money may cost. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera.
News from elsewhere in the region. Saudi Arabia has banned all demonstrations after a series of minor protests in the oil-producing eastern province. Mainly Shia protesters gathered in the towns of Qatif and Hofuf on Thursday and Friday. They've been demanding the release of all prisoners being held without trial, as well as better access to jobs. Authorities say the security forces will stop at nothing to quell the unrest. And after days of violent unrest in Oman, Sultan Qaboos has replaced 2 of his cabinet ministers, that's according to state media. Protesters there have been calling for more jobs and better political representation. Meanwhile, workers have been staging a sit-in at the main oil field in Hama to demand more state investment. Well, earlier we spoke to Ghanim Al-Najjar, a professor of political science at Kuwait University, and he says there are many parallels between the opposition movements rising up in countries across the Gulf.
I think what's happening now in the Gulf is only a reaction and reflection of what's happening around the area, and it was understandable that something like that to happen in Bahrain, and then Oman, then Saudi. Things were going, the dynamics, maybe each country is different, but dynamics are the same. People are not just demanding economic rights or better jobs or better living conditions. This is a matter that needs for the political spectrum to be expanded. You need to have more freedom of speech and opening up in the system, and that's the right time for this, for all the governments in the Gulf to intervene and try to comply with what's happening in the area, in the region, and in their specific countries.
Now, it's been more than 3 weeks since the Egyptian uprising that ousted Hosni Mubarak, but still the fallout continues. Amid ongoing protests, the former Interior Minister has pleaded not guilty to charges of money laundering and profiteering. Shireen Tadros has been following the case from Cairo.
First came the ousting, and now comes the justice. Habib al-Adli, Egypt's former Interior Minister, mobbed by demonstrators shouting, "Execute him," as he was leaving court. Al-Adli is on trial for money laundering and profiteering. But people here want to see him tried for ordering the police to open fire on protesters during the revolution. And that's not all. This man says Al-Adli is responsible for setting prisoners free and deliberately causing chaos during the protests. This woman tells us it's not just Al-Adli, but all corrupt Interior Ministry officials who have policed with an iron fist that should stand trial.
For over 10 years, Habib al-Adli was the face of one of the most hated institutions here, the Interior Ministry, as well as the security apparatus that came under its command. People are still asking for that security apparatus to be dismantled.
Outside state security headquarters in Cairo, that's exactly what was happening. Protesters demanding police forces leave the streets and a complete restructure of the security services. They claim now officials are going on trial. Police officers are burning and shredding any documents which could incriminate them and their bosses in the future.